South Africans may face another increase in petrol and diesel prices of above R2 per litre. And this, of course, amid rising international oil prices driven up mainly by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, data from the Central Energy Fund shows that South Africa is currently on track for a petrol price hike of between R1.99 and R2.04 at the end of March. The Department of Mineral Resources and Energy also told Parliament that it is considering a number of interventions to address South Africa's record high fuel prices, and these may include a possible introduction of fuel limits and the rationing of fuel if sanctions on Russia continue. Lumkile Mondi is with the School of Economics and Finance at Wits University, and he joins us now. Always good to have you. Welcome to Morning Live, Lumkile.
Good morning to you as well as the viewers this morning.
So, firstly, let's just start by perhaps expanding on the reasons for why we are seeing the fuel price hike at the moment. We know it's about geopolitical events in eastern Ukraine, but what are some of the other factors contributing to this rise?
So I want to first make this point that historically, South Africa as a net importer of oil has really ensured that it's got fuel or energy security. That meant that South Africa kept what we refer to as strategic reserves. They were kept under the apartheid regimes in the mines in Witbank, as well as in the storage facilities in Saldanha. And that ensured that when there are big challenges, those reserves can be used to subsidize the South African economy at the fuel pump. Subsequently, we all know that under Minister Jumat, we sold those at a far cheaper price, and an investigation was launched. So South Africa really, because of the choices in the democratic era that is made, found itself having very limited reserves than before, and therefore vulnerable. And hence, the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy 2 days ago making these suggestions that is looking at various ways of subsidizing South Africans to ensure that South Africans can afford the fuel prices that we find at the fuel pump.
So, and thanks so much for raising that particular matter, because we had that sale of the fuel reserves, and this was a few years ago. And I remember last week, Lumkile, speaking to Transnet about a fuel that's being stolen from that pipeline from KwaZulu-Natal up to Gauteng. And they spoke about more than 300 million litres of fuel that was stolen off the pipeline.
Well, I mean, this is the biggest challenge that I think South Africa faces of the distractions of capabilities of institutions. So when our prosecuting as well as our police have got weaknesses in terms of monitoring and enforcing some of these rule of law, and in the process, unemployment also hitting very, very hard because we misappropriated a lot of funds which are supposed to go to infrastructure across the economy, whether it's rail infrastructure, it is port infrastructure, pipeline infrastructure. That has meant that people are desperate, and even thugs, seeing an opportunity of a weakened state capacity-wise, they are trying to make money by destroying further our infrastructure, be it stealing the fuel along the pipeline, be it breaking down rail infrastructure and recycling it to make money. So this is really one of the features that some have argued that, when a state is failing, these are the indications thereof. So it's hurting Transnet, but it's also hurting the economy overall, because it means that even if we had capacity from NATREF as well as the imports perspective, we may not get all the products to Albertine and other areas in Gauteng because there's a leakage in the system, undermining other sectors, not only Transnet, and therefore hurting us badly at the time when we need fuel most.
So if you're looking at 3 million litres, and these would indicate, I'm just imagining, Lumkile, we're not talking about small-time crooks here. Because
yes,
there has to be some sort of organized syndicate working on getting that amount of fuel out of the system. But what are the implications of that, the selling of our reserves, and of course all the other attendant factors of those sort of things that impact the fuel price daily? How does all of that come together to land us where we are right now?
So this, which many people have argued, there's a paper that is out written by Ivor Chipkin and his school. And Ivor Chipkin talks about how these organized criminals are also, some of them are embedded within the ANC political economy, that the political project that we'd seen in South Africa, where these institutions that we've talked about were destroyed, was part of a political program. Therefore, what it means basically is that for many black poor who relied on public transport to get to places of work or to get to places of schools, no longer have choices. So if you used to use a train, you cannot get to school in town using train. You have to use a bus or use one of these private taxis where children go in a kumbi with about 15 to 20 children. But more importantly, it's not only those households that are impacted to infrastructure destruction. It means also the cost in South Africa of doing business are rising. Therefore, those costs then end up in all the goods and services that companies use as inputs, but also we as households have to pay when we do retail shopping. So the impact of this is pushing South Africa as a high-cost economy on the production side, but also for the consumers, they simply cannot afford. That is why many people in the debate in South Africa are now talking about the issues of distribution and the issues of income guarantees, because they can see that being a highly unequal society and having high costs rising, and a state that is able to enforce and guard against its own infrastructure because it's infiltrated by these syndicates. Therefore, it means we have to look at ways of protecting those that are vulnerable. And that's the debate I think that's going to have for quite some time.
So, Lumkile, while, as I say, we are aware of what's happening in Eastern Europe, so Russia ranked the third top oil-producing country in the world. The US and Saudi Arabia are still, of course, leading producers. But to what degree do those sanctions on Russia and a ban or a limit on the importing of fuel from Russia by countries such as maybe South Africa create the sort of scarcity and the tumble in oil prices that we are seeing? And also, from which countries do we actually import most of our crude oil?
Most of our crude oil comes from the Middle East. We know that we do source some from our neighbor, our African colleagues in Nigeria. But a lot of it comes from countries in Saudi Arabia as well as Iran, who have remained our partners continuously. Even, in fact, interestingly, under apartheid, even though there were sanctions, the sanction busters continued to supply the apartheid regime, albeit at a high cost. But what this is doing, as we have been focusing on the cost going forward, where the Automobile Association is talking about 24 rands per litre. What we're forgetting also is a much broader policy debate when we're talking about climate change. We've seen the reaction from many of the European countries talking about shifting reliance from Russian fossil and looking at South Africa as a supplier of fossils, specifically coal. So we've seen our commodities increasing and our exports really being very, very strong. However, again, we're having challenges about supplying that coal coal because of the Transnet infrastructure distractions that we're alluding to much earlier. But more importantly also, it asks many policy questions for South Africa's just transition. Is South Africa, given that Germany is talking about opening up old fossil fuel power plants, does South Africa then transition much quicker into renewables? Or does Minister Bantash go back to Parliament and ask Parliament to allow him to continue looking for oil and gas in the south coast of South Africa, and explore and see whether South Africa can access those fossil fuels, if there are any, and therefore delay the transition? Because simply it seems that there is no fair play in the game, that the Europeans particularly play the game to satisfy the interest of theirs and prescribe to Africans as to how they can transition. So that debate, I think, is going to come back to South Africa, and I'm hoping that both the Presidential Climate Change Commission as well as Mr. Mantashe think deeply. They think about the interest of South Africa and the interest of Africa around this transition, and see whether who dictates. Do we get dictated through by EU, or we take the debate back to the COP agreement that we had around the COP26 agreement around our transition, given that those, when they want to punish their own enemies, they revert to old ways of doing business. But South Africa and other countries are not allowed. So this is a debate. It's exciting for us as academics, and we look forward to hear both sides of the argument to see how and when is South Africa going to assert its own national interest, given the uncertainty in the world and the fact that the transition itself is being tested, given the behavior of NATO in relation to Russian fossil fuels.
And just to add to that, there's also the whole question of exploration, offshore exploration for oil off the coast of South Africa. And we've seen the sort of debates, and I would argue mainly one side of that argument being foregrounded, as opposed to us having a more wholesome discussion holistically about what the pros and cons are here and how we stand to benefit. But what are your views on that, Lumkile?
Well, I mean, the biggest weakness that we've seen, I think, from our government is the question of national interest. I think when our government fails to articulate national interest and protect its own infrastructure and the vulnerable, it therefore gets seen as a predatory state, where we saw that there were private companies already without a due process, which were in partnership with Shell. As we know, in terms of the law, the state has got about 30% free ride should this exploration succeed. So the fact that the state earlier on in the game gave away to private sectors create a lot of skepticism that some comrades might be in the deal, and therefore the public uproar that we've seen. So I think there's an opportunity here for government to put national interest first, and therefore when the argument around exploration, around development is couched and is lived by our politicians by putting South Africa first, it changed the discussion, and therefore can have a robust discussion around how do we ensure that in the transition all resources accept the poor, that the poor don't get marginalized, because already the conditions are much worse with mining that has left this community scarred, and the way we dispose our waste and all the other social ills that the poor experience. That talking about transition without looking at these other issues and national interest, South Africa will remain a meal for other interests, particularly European interests, who are driving their own territorial agenda. So that's the debate that we want to see about South Africa's asserting its own interests, but at the same time pushing a lot of these geopolitical issues to the League of Nations, the UN, because it seems to me that a lot of the issues are being monopolized by NATO and others, and we're leaving behind multilateral structures which are pivotal for us to drive a peaceful world, to drive a world that starts talking about a distribution of income in the world, inequality and poverty.
Lumkile, we into extra time, that means news time, but just a quick one on some of the proposals to actually try and cushion the blow for South African consumers at the pump in the coming month, because we know that if you look at paraffin, which is used by the poorest of the poor, that's set to go up by more than R2 per litre, at least at the mid-month projections as well. So what are some of the suggestions? Governments made proposals, the department at least, of employees working from home, perhaps capping, the price at some level. Quite a few suggestions were made, but what do you think would be best at this point?
So at this point, because even our national treasurer didn't talk so much about the increasing taxes there, at this point, I think we're going to have to basically surf the wave, but bring the issues that we've discussed this morning on the table and really start talking about national interest. Talk about how South Africa, in terms of Mr. Patel's localization strategy, that as it localizes industry, create jobs, how does it also ensure that the energy security, that as we do so, we're locating ourselves within the geopolitical transition, that rules apply the same. If Germany continues with coal, therefore others should also be allowed to do so. It can't be just because militarily and economically are powerful, therefore they can do as they wish. So that's the debate that I'm looking forward to, and I'm hoping that South Africans will learn a lot. But we need government reasserting our national interest than party interests and those that have been captured through patronage and corruption that we saw in South Africa and in the Zondo Commission.
Lumkile Mondi, thank you so much for your time this morning. Lumkile Mondi is with the School of Economics and Finance at Wits University and discussing some of the possible oil restrictions driven by the Ukraine-Russia war, and also this happening at a time where the global economy is opening up and starting to consume more than what has been produced.